So our last one, Aaron Reed, that's his bio up there. Level 2, he judges in Oklahoma. He's only been certified judging since November of about 2 years ago. But he's been judging for much longer than that as kind of your typical level 0 store judge. Not quite know-it-all, but guy who knows things. And he's presenting on out of order sequencing and shortcuts. So take it away, Aaron.
Thank you for the introduction. We're going to go ahead and get started. It took me a long time to figure out exactly how I wanted to start the presentation, because I kind of wanted to show what a shortcut was like, and I couldn't really think of a good way to do that. So I eventually decided on a time travel joke, but you guys didn't like it. But that's kind of what shortcuts are. Yeah, there it goes. It's a way of establishing something to where you end at a particular point, and how you get there is a little less relevant. And so I'm going to go with out-of-order shortcuts, a guide to shortcuts, out-of-order sequencing, and the crazy way that the game can be played. My hope for you for today is what you learn from this module is a definition of shortcut and out-of-order sequences. These are available in the MTR, which you should all have through Judge Core or Guide, depending on if you're Android or Apple. We're going to talk about how these work. We're going to talk about why these are important. We're going to talk about when these apply. And lastly, because I'm a huge fan of hands-on knowledge, we're going to have some examples. That's actually why hopefully every person has a handout, or if you don't have one, hopefully one next to you has. That's all the Oracle text. Every card that I have up here, the Oracle text is available for you, and if I remember correctly, I actually grouped them all together properly. So first, shortcuts. It's defined in the MTR in section 4.2. Specifically, it is an action that is taken by players to skip part of the technical play sequence without explicitly announcing them. And I thought it was really cool because I was like, I've got this great definition, I have this great example. The AMT already has it. Imagine if every time a player casts a spell, he or she says, I put it on the stack, I choose these targets, I tap this land for mana, and I pay the costs, instead of simply tapping the mountain and say, bolt your guy. Imagine if every time you played a turn, you had to say, okay, beginning step, untap phase, upkeep, and if you had to say every single step in phase, imagine how long that would take. Magic can't be played in 50 minutes doing that.
Sounds like Magic Online.
Right? Well, the good thing about Magic Online is that you don't have as much interaction. So that's where Moto kind of can succeed where this one can't. So we're going to talk about do not pass go. This was an article written by Toby Elliott. I believe it was during Kaladesh. And it talked about this particular exchange. I say go to attacks, because I have this cool Sarah angel, and it really just wants to say hi to you. And you say, cool. I'm going to Icy Manipulator your Sarah angel. I don't want to take that damage. But because of the nebulous language, I could say, well, since we're in main phase 1, I'm going to go ahead and cast this ball lightning, and I'm going to swing for lethal. So the problem was, by saying go to attacks, and you responding, where did you respond? Obviously, you wanted to prevent taking damage, but because it wasn't really established, that used to happen all the time. You'd also see an exchange like, go to combat. Sure. I'm going to activate my Mutavault, and I'm going to swing at you. Well, the problem with that is, you should have a chance to stop Mutavault from attacking you. But if I do that particular sequence, then it sounds like I'm already in declare attackers, and at that point, it's too late. And sure, you can say, well, NAP should have said, at the beginning of combat, I'm going to use Icy Manipulator. Or at the beginning of combat, after you activate, but before you declare an attacker. But we really don't want to put the onus on NAP. AP is always the driving force of where the turn is and is what is happening. NAP needs to be reactive, but should not have to be that specific. So people have already kind of looked at the Oracle text. They know where we're going, which is Pro Tour Aether Revolts. Specifically, I want to note here, the ruling listed here no longer applies. Do not use this knowledge at the next tournament that you use. It will go badly. It's round 8 with Segovia versus Win. So Segovia has 2 Scrap Heap Scroungers, a Heart of Kieran, and a Well-Fast Engineer. He says, combat. Wynn pauses for a moment and then kind of nods his head. There wasn't much communication. Segovia taps the Weldfast engineer to crew Heart of Kirin. Wynn calls for the judge. There's a little bit of an investigation that goes on, but the floor judge rules that combat meant Segovia was in declare attackers and therefore could not crew or use Weldfast engineer's trigger. This was appealed, and Toby Elliott, the head judge, upheld the ruling. He also told the coverage team that the best way to avoid this problem was to be specific as to why you had to go to beginning of combat. So say something like, beginning of combat trigger before your opponent has a chance to do anything else. So that way you don't weaponize the nebulous language. But that left a really bad taste in a lot of players' mouths. I'm sure anybody who was on Reddit during that time knows the number of threads and knows the number of comments that happened. So because of that, we kind of got a more elegant solution that we're going to go over real quick. These shortcuts are explicitly listed in the MTR. They are in 4.2. I've summarized them here. I'm going to give you some examples, but really all of the information is available at your fingertips. The first one is AP passes priority in their pre-combat main phase, or says phrases like, go to attacks or go to combat. If NAP responds, they are assumed to be acting at beginning of combat unless they are interacting with a beginning of combat trigger. By having that secondary clause in there, by saying, oh, you're trying to stop Goblin Rabblemaster from making a token, they're going to assume that you're acting in main phase 1. But if all you're trying to do is tap Sarah Angel again, you're in beginning of combat. Same thing is true for end of turn. Phrases like go or your turn. If I react to that, it's assumed that I'm acting at end of combat, end of turn. This one is really interesting to me. A player adds multiple items to the stack without explicitly holding priority. The shortcut of casting a spell is if I cast Lightning Bolt, it's assumed that I'm passing priority each time, unless I specifically say Lightning Bolt hold priority, or hold priority casting Lightning Bolt and this. A player casts an X spell without specifying what X is. Does anybody know what this shortcut is? Yes.
All available mana.
Yes, any available mana that is currently in the mana pool is used to cast the X spell. So if I have 8 green mana in my mana pool and I say Genesis Wave, it's assumed that I'm doing Genesis Wave for 5. A player makes a required choice before resolution. Who else wants to give me a good example of this? This one is a little nebulous. I'm not too concerned if you guys... yes, JD.
Fabricate?
Sorry, what?
Like fabricate?
Fabricate where you have to choose something from your library?
The ability where you choose +1/+1 counters or...
Not quite. Joseph.
Yeah, they're proposing what the choice will be on resolution if they're held to it unless you respond.
Right. Do you have a card example for that?
Fabricate would be a good one.
Fabricate's a little wonky. Zach.
Needle naming Dark Confidant?
Yes. Anytime that it has to say, as this enters the battlefield, make a choice. Or a card's like God's Willing from Theros, which is target creature you control gains protection of the color of your choice until end of turn, scry 1. If I say God's Willing pro-red without giving you a chance to respond, and you say, okay, I'm going to do this in response, you have denied my proposed shortcut, and therefore I can change my choice. So Pithing Needle is a great example of that. Players are assumed to pay costs of 0. So if you have anything that requires a 0 cost, either because you had to pay a converted mana cost of 0 from an effect like Tariff, you're assumed to pay 0 unless you explicitly say otherwise. If a target on the stack is required, the player is assumed to target the legal target closest to the top of that stack. If I cast Lightning Bolt and you say Counterspell, you're assumed to target that, even if there's other things on the stack. Unless you explicitly say what it is, you're assumed to target the topmost legal target. AP is assumed to be attacking NAP and not a planeswalker they control. So if all you do is say swing with these guys, you're assumed to be hitting the player, not the planeswalker. This one is about to not exist, but it does currently exist in the MTR, so I included it. If you say bolt target Lily, it's assumed that you are using the redirect rule. That's about to change. A player that doesn't scry is assumed to have not looked and chosen to leave the card on top. If you have something that says scry 2 and you do not know what those cards are, but it's assumed that you left them on top anyway. That's good in case you have something that randomizes the library. Those 2 cards don't stay there. It's assumed that you did not look, but you also did not rearrange. In Two-Headed Giant, AP is assumed, or the active team, should be team, is assumed to attack the primary head. And lastly, literally anything else. If you and I agree on something, and it doesn't violate any of the rules, it's a shortcut. That's literally how shortcuts work. There are 4 things that are explicitly forbidden, though. A player cannot propose a shortcut that requires priority passes unless they are able to detail every step. A lot of these are like infinite loops, where you say, I'm going to use Devoted Druid and Vizier of Remedies to get 10,000 mana. Well, untapping Devoted Druid is a priority pass, but you're going to say, I'm going to do this 10,000 times and end up with 10,000 mana. That's a shortcut. Players may not use previously undeclared tournament shortcuts or modify them without announcing the changes. I can't just say, well, I mean, I know what this particular thing means. Why don't they? So I can't technically just put F6 on the table. My opponent might not know what that means. It's not legally listed before, and if I don't talk to my opponent about it, it's not a legal shortcut. I also can't change a shortcut. So I can't say attacks means goes to beginning of combat no matter what. You have to have the modification done before the shortcuts are announced. Players cannot ask for priority and then do nothing with it. So this means that if you are in your main phase 1, I can't say, so I can lightning bolt you now, right? My opponent's probably going to go, sure, have at it. I can't then just go, no, never mind, I'm going to pass priority back to you. We're now in combat. You can't cast anything. No. If this happens, you just return to the point before priority was asked for. Lastly, this one is also new. Players cannot assume their opponent has taken an option with no visible change. Who knows exactly what this was written for? Path to Exile. Path to Exile says, exile target creature. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put that card on the battlefield tap, shuffle their library. I can't just assume that you didn't look. I can't just assume that you're not going to get a land. I have to explicitly ask for that. So why are shortcuts so important? Well, we kind of already touched on this. It allows the game to be played quickly, or in some cases, allow the game to be played at all. If I had to declare every single time I pass priority when I'm going for an indeterminately high amount of mana with Devoted Druid and Vizier of Remedies, I would literally stop the game. Sorry, what? Right, exactly. So it allows the game to be played only knowing a few terms. For instance, this is the sign language sign for combat. I can play against somebody who doesn't know much by only knowing a few words like combat, pass, in response. And the last thing is it allows the game to be played their way. I can create a new shortcut between me and my friends. I can use F6 at home, or as long as I get my opponent's permission, I can use it in the tournament because it's a proposed shortcut. Out of order sequencing is kind of related to shortcuts. One of the biggest differences, this is defined in 4.3. It says, due to the complexity of accurately representing a game of Magic, it is acceptable for players to engage in a block of actions that, while technically in an incorrect order, arrive at a legal and clearly understood game state once they're complete. So kind of going back to the history of Magic, in some of the olden days, situations used to be extremely by the book. And I'm going to kind of talk about what I mean by the book. If AP casts Harrow, sacrifices a land, and moves it to the graveyard, they can go for the library, but the NAP can raise their hand and say, Judge, my opponent moved Harrow to the graveyard. Moving to the graveyard is the last thing you do when resolving a spell. They've searched and failed to find. This is the picture of Harrow, which just basically says, sacrifice your library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them into play. But that was technically calls that would be received at tournaments. A document appeared in 2004 called Ruling by Intent. It wasn't actually codified in anything like the MTR. It wasn't even really talked about much. It was a 2004 article that was, I believe, written in German initially, and then appeared on the mothership. But it kind of went over a few things. It meant that you were able to allow a player to perform a certain action that they intended to, while they still technically could, even though now it is too late to go strictly by the rules. This was the precursor to out-of-order sequences. So going back to that Harrow example, it makes sense of what they're trying to do. They're still trying to get 2 lands. They just moved the card to the graveyard first for whatever reason. The first thing is that the intent of the player at the time when he could legally have made the decision must be clear. So again, going back to Harrow, obviously he's trying to get 2 lands. I don't think anybody is going to argue that. The last thing is that the player may gain no advantage because of the sloppy play. Moving Harrow to your graveyard accomplishes almost nothing. There's no extra information that I get from that. There's no advantage of trying to trick out my opponent. All I did was move it to the graveyard too quickly. Again, all it says to do is to search your library for 2 lands and put them into play. I'm pretty sure that I'm playing that to get 2 lands. So we go from ruling by intent to out-of-order sequencing. Because in 2008 at Pro Tour Berlin, there was a cool deck that I really wish was available to be played called Combo Elves. Used a lot of fun cards like Essence Warden, Nettle Sentinel, Heritage Druid, Glimpse of Nature, and Grape Shot. Right? Why do elves have the ability to just... Anyway. But there was a really cool interaction that happened with Glimpse of Nature, which says whenever you play a creature spell this turn, draw a card, and Elvish Visionary, which says when it comes into play, draw a card. But the problem is, if you attempt to draw both cards at the same time, you've technically missed the Glimpse of Nature trigger. Glimpse of Nature triggers on cast before Elvish Visionary enters the battlefield. So technically it should go cast Visionary, draw a card, Visionary enters, trigger resolves, draw a card. There was also the article listed this, I couldn't find any other information about it, but it listed that there was a line of play that ended with, and I gained 20 life from Essence Warden. Technically, he missed 19 of those triggers. And this was back in a time when missing triggers led to game loss pretty consistently because we didn't have the nice and intuitive rules that we have today. Out-of-order sequencing was in the MTR. The earliest MTR document I could find was in June 2009. And out-of-order sequencing was already listed in the MTR at that point. There are 4 conditions for it to be out-of-order sequencing. The first is that the actions actually have to be a batch or a block of actions. I can't out-of-order sequencing 3 steps in the future and say, oh, this is what I meant to do. Second, an out-of-order sequence can't result in any player prematurely gaining information. This is the only thing that has been added since 2009. I actually checked both documents. This line basically says that I can't do something that ends in out of order to get extra information about decisions that I might make. It doesn't allow you to go back in time and forget something. So maybe I would have ended up at the right state, but oh, I forgot that this does that. If you forgot, it's too late. The last thing is that an opponent can request that the player perform the out-of-order action in the correct order. Maybe they have a reason to. Maybe I have a burn spell in hand and I really want to take care of your creature before you're able to do something as a mana ability. Or sorry, that's not a mana ability that you're using as a mana ability. And so, kind of going back, why is out-of-order sequencing so important? Well, it allows for more natural gameplay. Going back to that Glimpse of Nature thing, it's much more convenient for me and much more time efficient if I can say, cast Elvish Visionary, draw 2 cards. That's where the game state's going to end up anyway. Why does it matter that I didn't draw 1, then draw 1? And it removes gotcha moments. It removes my opponent being able to go, Judge, he missed his trigger. We ended at the same state in 1 single block of actions. Out-of-order sequencing. It allows the game to be more intuitive. So I know why you guys came here. You guys came here for the practice problems, right? So I kind of want to get everybody kind of aroused, kind of energized. I know it's been a long day. So one of my favorite cards that came out recently, I've been playing for a long time, Goblin Rabblemaster. The main reason I like it is for the Rabbles, actually. It's a good Goblin card, but really, I want everybody to give me about 5 to 10 good Rabbles. And count of 3. 3, 2, 1. Yeah, thank you. See, doesn't everybody feel better now? All right, so going on to the practice questions. There are several examples upcoming. I believe I have 5 or 6. Your job is to determine whether or not it's an example of a shortcut, out-of-order sequencing, both, or neither. You're also going to apply infractions, penalties, and fixes as needed. So, we'll start with our first question. Alejandro controls 2 scrap heap scroungers, Heart of Kieran, and Well-Fast Engineer. Man, this really looks familiar, doesn't it? Man, I wish I would have studied earlier. He says, combat, Natasha Nouts. He then says, trigger Well-Fast, trigger Well-Fast, target Heart of Kieran, tap Well-Fast to crew Heart of Kieran, and swing out. Oh. So, who wants to go and tell me whether they think that this is a shortcut or out-of-order sequencing, if something went wrong? Got a participant.
All right, this one's out of order sequencing. The engineer can't target the Heart of Kieran before it's crewed. But it's all a block of actions that's happening at the beginning of combat phase, and since we just changed that rule, it is okay to do that after the nod. So this would be out of order sequencing with no penalty.
It's actually pretty close. Does anybody else have any other ideas before I move on? Got Johnny over there.
So even though the player remembered their Weldfast Engineer trigger, they can't target the Heart of Kieran because the requirement is that the target targets an artifact creature, and Heart of Kieran is not a creature when the trigger goes on the stack.
So anything else to add to that?
So this should be a penalty for a game rule violation because they can't target that that card with that ability. So we would need to back up to the point when the trigger's on the stack and have them choose a legal target.
That's 100% correct. So the shortcut was used, but technically it's not out of order sequencing because it was an illegal action. The shortcut that was proposed was combat. All they were saying is, I pass priority until we get to beginning of combat. So Well-Fast Engineer triggers at beginning of combat and requires a legal target in order to go onto the stack. So we would give a GRV, we'd do a warning, we'd back up to the beginning of combat, and instruct Alejandro to choose a legal target this time. So that's the first question. Good. I'm glad we all paid attention. It starts getting more fun. Allison controls 2 forests, one of which is enchanted by Utopia Sprawl, with red chosen, and an Arbor Elf. She then announces her intent to cast Stormbreath Dragon, which I'm going to remove from the screen so that you guys can see the pretty pictures. It will come back. She then taps the 2 forests, taps Arbor Elf to untap the forest that is enchanted by Utopia Sprawl, and then taps that forest. So, she has tapped 2 forests, generating green, red, tapped Arbor Elf to untap the forest, and produced another green-red. Is this out of order sequencing? Shortcut? Both? Neither. I've got a question back there. Are you answering or? Okay. We'll go ahead and have you go, Mark.
All right, so in this scenario, this is actually going to be a case of out-of-order sequencing because the player's already, announced the casting of Stormbreath Dragon, and she's trying to use Arbor Elf's ability as a mana ability to pay for the cost. But Arbor Elf is not a mana ability, so you have to activate it before you go and try to pay the cost for it.
Bonus points. Why is Arbor Elf not a mana ability?
Because it targets.
That is a great reason as to why. Joseph, you've got your hand up.
I'm going to take a look at the board and see whether there's any way to have interacted with Arbor Elf or Utopia Sprawl or anything like that, and investigate why it is that they're trying to use Arbor Elf as a mana ability and try to sort of bypass the opponent's ability to interact with this non-mana ability.
And that's a great point. So you both have really hit the nail on the head. It is out of order sequencing. There's no shortcut, though. At least not insofar other than saying, I cast my spell and skip announcing the 7 different parts of casting a spell. Arbor Elf's ability is not a mana ability, and therefore cannot be used in the middle of casting a spell. there is technically no infraction. So the one thing that he brought up is investigate. Make sure that they are not trying to cheat their opponent out of a way to respond, but what can the opponent do to also ensure that? Yep, so we had a person in the back who declared that you can ask them to do it in the appropriate order. They can say, wait, that's not a mana ability, you can't do that. Can you go back to before you cast it and tap Arbor Elf? Because maybe they have a stifle in hand. Maybe they have some way to stop it from being so effective. Very good. Yeah, go ahead.
We have the powers of the judge to make sure this isn't a situation where AP is going to go, oh, he has a way to respond. I'm not going to do it. We have the power to sort of make sure things don't go that direction. Instead, we say we're going to always do this in the correct order because there's always the chance an opponent in the future will be able to respond.
Yes and no. So we're not going to tell players that they have to do everything in the proper order. That's literally what out-of-order sequencing is. And it's also not technically a backup. You're not telling them to go back in time and not do what they did before. That's what a backup technically is. You completely remove the timeline where the backup was not in play. In this case, all you're doing is you're saying, you've done a few steps, I want you to do them right. You're still holding them to their line of action, assuming it's a legal line of action. But that's also a really good point. Anything else before we move on to my next example? Man, you guys are blowing through these. I put way more time out here for discussion. Actually, I have one at the end that I'm going to have a lot of fun discussing with you guys. Aaron controls a Vizier of Remedies and a Devoted Druid with a -1/-1 counter on it. He says, I'm going to tap to add green. I'm going to add a -1/-1, which technically -1/-1. And I'm going to untap Devoted Druid. I'm going to tap to add green again, and I'm going to do this to end with 10,000 green mana. Here we have Devoted Druid being tapped and untapped, because I spent way too much time on this presentation to not go through all of this. All right, who wants to tell me whether this is out-of-order sequencing or shortcut? Yeah, right here in the front.
It's a shortcut. There's no infraction. There's no penalty.
Is it out-of-order sequencing?
It's not out of order sequencing
Why not?
because he explicitly says add a -1/-1 counter, which is paying the cost to untap it, and then it explicitly saying I'm going to tap it again.
Okay. Any other ideas? Any other thoughts? Got another one in the back?
Actually, the way I'm looking at it, the Devoted Druid would never untap it. Stay game effects would look at it and say it's got a second -1/-1 counter. It goes away before the Vizier takes it off.
Actually, the Vizier of Remedy is a replacement effect. And so it says, if one or more -1/-1 counters would be put on a creature you control, put that many -1 on there instead. So Devoted Druid goes to put a -1/-1 counter on itself. Vizier says, put one less on you. So he goes, cool, I'm going to put 0 on myself. So he actually doesn't kill himself. No, it's a replacement effect. Right, you go to put 1 on there. You put 1 less on there. 1 - 1 is 0. Yes, you do still use the stack for the untap, though. And that's actually why it is, in fact, a shortcut. You are proposing a number of steps where you say you pass priority each time. When I go to untap my Devoted Druid, that is whenever you say, okay, I have no response to that. And I'm proposing that instead of passing that priority to you each time, that we just end at the proper point. The shortcut is repeating the loop the 10,000 times. There is no infraction. This one was actually a really fun standard combo back in the day, and I miss it. So first, Alex controls Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. He then has Temur Sabertooth, Voyaging Satyr, Temur Ascendancy, and Colony Hydra. Temur Ascendancy and Colony Hydra will be needed later, but they're not important at the start, so we're going to pull them off the board. He then activates Nykthos to add 12 green mana. He taps Voyaging Satyr to untap Nykthos. He then activates Temur Sabertooth's ability, targeting Voyaging Satyr, bouncing it to his hand. He then casts Voyaging Satyr again and announces 10,000 mana, because remember, his creatures have haste. He then says, I'm going to do this again with Colony Hydra 5 times, and I'm going to draw 5 cards. Nadine nods, and then Alex draws 5 cards. Is this a shortcut, out of order sequencing, both or neither?
It's both a shortcut and an out of order sequencing.
Why?
So the Voyaging Satyr, once again, is not a mana ability. So that's out of order to make all the extra mana. And he's shortcutting the Hydra, saying that he's just going to bounce it every single time and just draw the 5 cards at the end of the ascendancy. Anyway, right?
Okay. Do we have any other opinions? We got Joseph here again.
I'm actually going to say the exact opposite. Well, we're saying, 10,000 mana is proposing a shortcut of passing priority that many times as well on all the activations of Sabretooth, cast Satyr, tap Satyr, Sabretooth, cast Satyr, tap Satyr. And when we get to the drawing of the 5 cards all at once, it's an out of order that's sort of understood like a shortcut would be.
Okay. Any other opinions? Joseph, I'm going to have to stop calling on you, man. You're just crushing it out here. It's actually both, yeah. The shortcut is the loop leading to the 10,000 mana because, as he said, every time I'm activating an ability, priority pass. Bouncing it to my hand, I do have priority at that point. Casting Voyaging Satyr, priority pass. Tap, priority pass. All of these are understood in the shortcut that ends in 10,000 mana. The out-of-order sequencing is drawing the 5 cards at once. Because I look at it and I say, okay, I'm going to draw 5. Technically, it's 5 separate instances of draw a card. But to make things faster, just going to reach over and grab 5. It doesn't change any information. I ended the same place. No infraction. Anatoly has Jeskai Ascendancy. Hey, my last slideshow had Manifest. I'm a huge fan of corner cases. He casts Lightning Bolt, targeting his opponent. He retains priority and casts 3 more Lightning Bolts, retaining priority each time. The opponent doesn't respond. Once all 4 have been cast, he says, loot 4 times. Nathan nods. He then draws 4 cards at once and discards 4 cards. I hear a lot of groaning in the audience. That's probably a good start. Did you have your hand up to answer? All right, go ahead.
There is an infraction, though I can't think of it at the moment because I'm on 6 cups of coffee. But he is actually gaining information by being able to draw 4 and then make the decision to discard 4 at once after he's drawn all 4, where they're 4 individual abilities. So it is a block. It is a block of actions. So it is not out of order sequencing because he is gaining information and there is an infraction here. I'm not sure what it is at the moment.
Okay.
I know he's inappropriately resolving what he thinks is 4 abilities, but that's all that I can come up with at the moment.
All right. So we have a person saying it is not out of order sequencing. Was there a shortcut or not?
Yeah, it's shortcutting because he's asking him, says loot 4 times, and he goes yes, okay. So he's gonna you just do it 4 times. All right, cool. But then he does not perform the loot 4 times. He does it completely incorrectly. So yeah, I would say it's a shortcut, but it is not out of order sequencing.
Okay. Any other opinions? Got one in the back. I want to make Ben get his workout today. This is awesome. Yep.
Because he is choosing to put multiple items onto the stack without explicitly holding priority, that's a shortcut.
Actually, he does explicitly hold priority.
He didn't?
Yeah, he retains priority. Sorry, I guess that is a little bit nebulous. Let me clarify. Each time that he holds priority, each time he retains priority, he's explicitly stating Lightning Bolt, hold priority. Lightning Bolt, hold priority. Sorry. I will clarify that for the next time I give this presentation. Do I have anybody else? Any other opinions? Got another one from?
This is out of order sequencing because, as it was said earlier, he needs to draw the card separately, but he also has to resolve the lightning bolt that caused each trigger before we can go to the next trigger, as the lightning bolts are placed on the stack in between the triggers from Jeskai Ascendancy.
So the way that it works, he's casting Lightning Bolt, and then he's casting it again. And so each time the trigger is on the stack when he successfully casts it. But he could just say take 12, and the opponent could say okay if he doesn't have a response. So that's kind of where out-of-order sequencing comes into play. Do I have anybody else? Do I have anybody who wants to guess as to what the infraction is if there is an infraction? Yeah, I mean, that's definitely an investigation right there. But that's not what this, module is about. And then I've got one more after that.
So I think the infraction would be drawing extra cards.
That doesn't actually exist anymore. So that's a possible. That's the other one that's possible. And then I've got one more over here, and then I'm going to go ahead and push towards
So
the
the
answer.
other one that was possible was someone mentioned.
Sorry, hidden card error is
Yeah.
the other possible one. I keep forgetting that not everybody's mic'd. Game rule violation.
And game rule violation.
So I'm going to take this moment to do a little aside. Any infraction at all can technically be a game rule violation. Your job as a judge is to know which ones don't fall under the catch-all. So there's no shortcut or out-of-order sequencing, at least for the most part. So a lot of people say that there's a shortcut because he's casting a spell. That's passing priority. He specifically avoided it by holding priority. And then the point that was made, knowledge was prematurely gained. By drawing all 4 cards at once, he knows whether or not to discard first, second, or third card. So it cannot be out-of-order sequencing. The infraction fix penalty that I would propose is hidden card error warning. You would recreate the set and have Anatoly resolve each trigger separately.
What could result in no hidden card error?
So if there was no set in his hand and all 4 cards went there, you know the order of the cards. So if he just draws all 4 and pitches all 4, although at that point I would also argue that there's no real penalty because there was no information to be used. Joseph.
I want to talk again. I want to argue that this can't be HCE because we went from a hidden set to a public, from a hidden zone to a public zone.
Not entirely. Whenever I draw a card, unless I just turn it over into the graveyard, it touched my hand. So the hidden set library goes to hidden set hand before going to graveyard public zone. So there's no way to know that the card that I drew was the card that I just put in the graveyard, unless I have no cards in hand. Any other questions before we move on? All right. Sorry. Okay.
It's not that big of a deal.
This is the final practice question I have that I expect an answer on. I have one more after, but it's more of a thought process. Ashton controls Thing in the Ice with 2 counters on it. It's a cool card. Nathan controls Forest Bear. For those of you that aren't avid on Slack, that is Josh McCurley on Forest Bear. There's also a fantastic playmat of Josh McCurley on Forest Bear, or McCurley Bear, as I commonly call it. Ashton casts Harness Lightning, targeting Forest Bear. He then announces 2 damage, ticks up his energy by 1, and goes to remove a counter from Thing in the Ice. Nathan calls you over. Is this a shortcut? Out of order sequencing? Both or neither. Who wants to take a stab? This one I expect an answer on. The next one's more thought process.
So it's definitely out of order sequencing because the Thing in the Ice counter should have come off when you cast Harness Lightning. It's a cast trigger. So that should have gone on the stack first. And then the Harness Lightning would have resolved after the cast trigger, and you chose the number of energy. So it's kind of like shortcutting and out of order sequencing because you kind of shortcut the energy gain, and then you're going to use 2 of it anyway. So you shortcut the energy counters, but it's out of order because the Thing in the Ice trigger should have gone on the stack first.
Okay. Any other thoughts? All right. You are, sorry. Go ahead, Zach. Yeah.
I don't think this is out of order sequencing because the only thing that's happening here is a trigger. So when you cast Harness Lightning, a trigger should be going on the stack in which both players, in a way, have a chance to respond to. So that trigger has simply been missed because he went ahead to begin resolving the spell.
Okay. So I'd like to kind of remind you back to Glimpse of Nature and Elvish Visionary. If I go to draw a card from Elvish Visionary, I have missed my card draw from Glimpse of Nature. So when I go to draw 2 at the same time, it can't be argued that I'm going for the first one, then going for the second one. So there is a line to draw between Mist Trigger and out of order sequencing. He can't forget the thing in the ice trigger. He can't go, oh yeah, and I was supposed to remove that trigger. No, you forgot it. But if it's clear that he was just intending to move all of his dice or all of his counters at the same time, then there's a little bit more wiggle room. So for me, in this particular instance, there's a little bit of a shortcut where he says, you know, deal 2, go up by 1 energy. But it is out of order sequencing. There's not really an infraction here. Now, again, one of the key components is you can't retroactively go back and say, oh yeah, I meant to do this, but it's okay because it was all one action. The player has to know what they're doing and just, for lack of a better term, play a little sloppy, as Ruling by Intent said. This one's going to kind of garner a lot of thought. I don't actually expect an answer. I have my own opinions on it. Anton is playing Storm. As he begins to combo off, Nathan writes F6 on a piece of paper and sets it on the table in front of him. Anton casts 15 different spells, which is pretty common. And during this time, Nathan literally does nothing. Anton then casts Grape Shot. Nathan removes the F6 from the table and then casts a Disallow on the Storm trigger. So Storm says, when you play the spell, copy it. Disallow says, counter target spell activated or triggered ability. So who has any thoughts about this right now? I have about 7 minutes left, and I do have time for Q&A. Go ahead.
So F6 in a live Magic tournament doesn't really mean anything unless it's been agreed to during a match.
Mm-hmm. Do I have any other opinions? Joseph.
Even if it's agreed upon in a tournament, it's a shortcut, and the moment he takes another action, you're not held to it.
So there's a number of problems with the scenario. First and foremost is the players did not communicate well. Even if you assume that F6 means pass priority until my next turn, which is obviously what NAP was wanting to suggest, that doesn't work with shortcuts because I am proposing an ending without knowing all of the steps that end there, that lead to that point. I can't know what my opponent's going to cast, so I can't legally propose a shortcut that says pass priority until my next turn. That's not a binding shortcut. But that also being said, that also means that NAP is weaponizing the ambiguity by putting F6 on the table. I don't have a good answer. I know how I would react. And it would not be very kind to at least one of the players. But you also have the point that AP is required for the spacing and timing of the turn. That's why we had the beginning of combat change. That's why you couldn't just say combat and go to beginning of combat before, is because AP was required to make everything clear because NAP does not have that responsibility. So it's also on AP for not saying, what does F6 mean? Are you going to react when I have Grape Shot? You know, there's a lot that needed to be done that wasn't. And so this is kind of a point of when it goes wrong. You know, at this tournament, you have to decide, you know, did they make a violation? Did they knowingly break a rule in the MTR? You know, maybe you feel that way. Maybe you feel like this is a time to break out the disqualification paperwork. Maybe you feel that him putting F6 on the table was fine because it wasn't really decided upon, even though he knew his opponent was going to take that information from it. That's up for you to decide. You have some questions for me?
This was a scenario when, before I was even considering being a judge, and it kind of has to do with this. My opponent had 2 fetches on the field, and at the end of my turn, they fetched twice, and I asked them, so you're fetching, holding priority, and then fetching? And they said, yes. I say, in response, Shadow of Doubt.
I'll have to look at what Shadow of Doubt does.
They can't search their library.
Okay.
And so, is he allowed to at that point? He just took it and he didn't search his library. He just went to his turn and couldn't play the game afterward, and he lost. Could he have called a judge over and tried to rewind that?
In my opinion, based on the scenario, no. You clarified whether or not he was holding priority when he says crack both of these.
Yes.
So whenever you did that, you have established his line of play where he has both of those effects on the stack. Then you cast Shadow of Doubt.
Okay.
So in that line, because you have created that scenario and you have clarified the language, there's no recourse that he has at that point.
Okay.
You're pass the mic to the person behind you, please.
Can non-active player hold priority when it's not like when they're non-active player?
You can cast spells and you can hold priority. I'm a little fuzzy on the priority rules. I've always been confused about whether or not priority returns to the active player when an AP casts. I will look into that and get back with you.
Thank you.
I don't think I have time for any more questions, unfortunately, even though the timer says I have 3 minutes left. I do kind of want, huh? It's approximate. Right. Man, I would love to have approximately 3 minutes left in a round of Magic when I go to turns. There's a few special things I want to give. First, if you haven't checked out Toby Elliott's rule policy blog, it's fantastic. He goes through and details everything that you need to know, especially with rule changes. Nathaniel Lawrence wrote an article called Shortcut It Out that kind of went over all of the basics of shortcuts. Donato Del Giudice wrote Out of Order Sequencing. I can't remember the name of the judge who wrote Ruling by Intent. And lastly, I want to thank this random blog called Yagatog that had the Gatherer plaintext file, which is why you all have your papers. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to find me after the event or find me on Slack.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone on the stream.